The greatest wealth is to live content with little. The year is 387 BC. A 40-year-old man stands at the edge of a sacred grove just outside Athens, surveying the land he has just purchased. Around him, ancient olive trees cast dappled shadows across the ground. This grove is dedicated to the hero Academus, but this man has a different vision. He sees students gathered beneath these trees, debating the nature of reality. He sees mathematicians drawing geometric figures in the sand. He sees philosophers ascending toward eternal truths that no tyrant can destroy, that no democratic mob can vote away. 12 years ago, he watched the wisest man he ever knew drink poison, condemned by the very city that should have honored him. Now he has returned to do something no philosopher has ever done before: create an institution that will outlast any individual life, preserve wisdom across generations. This grove will become the Academy, the world's first university, and it will endure for 900 years. This is Plato, and tonight we follow his extraordinary journey from privileged aristocrat to devoted student, from political failure to history's most influential philosopher. A man who wrote dialogues that still challenge us 24 centuries later. A man who asked what justice truly is, what the good life looks like, who believed that beyond this imperfect world lies a realm of eternal truth. Before we begin tonight's journey, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It really helps others discover these explorations of history. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. So, settle in and prepare to walk through ancient Athens with a man who transformed grief into wisdom, who built an institution that shaped Western civilization, who dared to believe that philosophy could change the world. This is the story of Plato, the philosopher who taught us to question reality itself. Chapter 1. The Making of an Aristocrat. Plato entered the world around 428 or 427 BC in Athens, or possibly on the nearby island of Aegina, into a family that embodied the very essence of Athenian nobility. His father Ariston claimed descent from Codrus, the legendary last king of Athens, who, according to myth, sacrificed himself to save the city. On his mother's side, Perictione traced her lineage to Solon, the great lawgiver who had established Athens' first democratic constitution 2 centuries earlier. This was not merely aristocracy of wealth. This was aristocracy of blood, of history, of the kind of heritage that shaped a young man's sense of duty and destiny. The household into which Plato was born was one of culture and learning. His father died when Plato was still young, and his mother remarried her uncle Perilamps, a man of considerable political influence who had served as ambassador to Persia. Plato grew up surrounded by the conversation of statesmen and intellectuals, absorbing the atmosphere of Athenian political life at its most refined. The Athens of Plato's childhood was a city of extraordinary contrasts. It was the cultural capital of the Greek world, home to the Parthenon, recently completed in all its marble splendor. The tragic plays of Sophocles and Euripides drew crowds to the theater of Dionysus. Sculptors like Phidias created works of such beauty they seemed to capture the divine. The Agora bustled with merchants from across the Mediterranean, while in the gymnasia and symposia, men debated questions of virtue, justice, and the good life. Yet this golden age was already tarnished by war. The Peloponnesian War against Sparta had begun just before Plato's birth and would rage throughout his childhood and youth. Year after year, the conflict ground on, draining Athens of resources and young men. Plato would have grown up with the constant presence of war, the arrival of news of battles won and lost, the sight of funeral processions for the fallen, the arguments in the assembly about strategy and alliance. As a boy of the aristocratic class, Plato received the finest education Athens could offer. He was taught by distinguished masters in gymnastics, music, and grammar. The curriculum focused on cultivating what the Greeks called arete, excellence or virtue in all things. Physical training developed the body, music trained the soul, and the study of poetry and rhetoric sharpened the mind. Ancient sources tell us that Plato showed exceptional promise in all these areas. Some accounts, perhaps embellished by later admirers, claim he competed in wrestling and was decorated for athletic achievement. Whether strictly true or not, these stories reflect the ideal of the well-rounded gentleman that Plato's education sought to create. He was trained to be a leader, to speak persuasively in the assembly, to command in war, to embody the virtues that made Athens great. His teachers included Cratylus, a follower of the philosopher Heraclitus, who introduced young Plato to the idea that everything in the physical world is in constant flux, that you cannot step into the same river twice because both you and the river are always changing. But it was poetry and drama that first captured Plato's imagination. As a young man, he wrote tragic plays, composing verses in the grand tradition of the Athenian theater. He dreamed, perhaps, of winning the tragic competitions at the Dionysian festivals, of having his words spoken before thousands, of achieving glory as a poet. This early literary ambition would never be fulfilled in the way he imagined, yet it would shape everything he later wrote. The philosophical dialogues for which Plato became famous are themselves works of dramatic art, carefully constructed conversations that read like plays, populated with vivid characters and building to moments of revelation or perplexity. The would-be tragedian never disappeared. He simply found a different stage and a different kind of drama to explore. The Athens of Plato's youth was not only a place of war and culture, but also a hotbed of intellectual ferment. Sophists, itinerant teachers who claimed to teach virtue and rhetoric for a fee, traveled from city to city, attracting students and stirring controversy. They taught young men the art of persuasive speaking, the techniques of arguing any side of a question, skills essential for success in democratic Athens, where political power depended on swaying the assembly and the law courts. Yet the sophists troubled many traditional Athenians. They seemed to care more for winning arguments than discovering truth, more for teaching tricks of rhetoric than instilling genuine virtue. Their relativism, their suggestion that justice and morality were merely social conventions rather than eternal truths, struck at the foundations of traditional values. Into this world of sophistic teaching and traditional education, Plato was born and raised, absorbing both the old aristocratic virtues and the new questioning spirit that was transforming Greek thought. Chapter 2: The Encounter That Changed Everything. Around the age of 20, probably in 407 or 406 BC, Plato experienced the encounter that would redirect the entire course of his life. He met Socrates. The meeting, if we can trust the legends that grew around it, was dramatic. One account tells us that Plato was on his way to submit his tragic plays for competition when he encountered the strange figure of Socrates engaged in philosophical conversation. After listening to this remarkable man question and probe, examining ideas with relentless logic, Plato is said to have burned his plays on the spot, recognizing that he had found something more important than poetic glory. Whether the story is literally true matters less than what it represents. Plato had discovered a new kind of drama, not the scripted performances of the theater, but the living drama of dialectic inquiry, the collaborative search for truth through question and answer. Socrates was unlike anyone else in Athens. Already in his 60s when Plato met him, Socrates had spent decades engaging his fellow citizens in philosophical conversations. He was a peculiar figure, by all accounts physically unprepossessing, even ugly according to ancient descriptions, with a snub nose and protruding eyes. He went about in worn clothing, often barefoot, seemingly indifferent to comfort or convention. Yet his oddity only emphasized the extraordinary quality of his mind and the power of his method. Socrates did not lecture or give speeches. Instead, he asked questions. He would approach someone, often someone with a reputation for wisdom or expertise, and inquire about their area of supposed knowledge. What is courage? What is justice? What is piety? The question seemed simple, but as the conversation progressed, Socrates would expose contradictions in his interlocutor's beliefs, showing that what seemed like knowledge was merely unexamined opinion. This Socratic method, as it came to be called, was revolutionary. It assumed that wisdom began not with confident assertions, but with recognizing one's own ignorance. Socrates claimed that the oracle at Delphi had declared him the wisest man in Athens, but he understood this to mean only that he alone knew that he knew nothing. Everyone else was ignorant, but believed themselves wise. Socrates at least knew the limits of his knowledge. For young Plato, encountering Socrates must have been revelatory and unsettling in equal measure. Here was a man who rejected everything Plato had been raised to value: wealth, political power, conventional success, yet who possessed a kind of wisdom and moral authority that put the achievements of generals and politicians to shame. Socrates lived simply, accepted poverty, faced danger with equanimity, and pursued truth with a purity of purpose that was both inspiring and troubling to those around him. Plato became one of Socrates' devoted followers, part of the circle of mostly young, mostly aristocratic men who gathered around the philosopher. For perhaps 8 years, Plato was immersed in the practice of Socratic inquiry. Day after day, he witnessed his master engaging all comers in philosophical conversation, in the agora, in the gymnasia, at symposia. He saw how Socrates could reduce confident experts to confusion, how he could draw insights from the most unexpected sources, how he remained unflappable in the face of hostility or mockery. These years of apprenticeship were Plato's true education, more profound than anything his formal teachers had provided. He learned not a system of doctrines, but a way of thinking, a commitment to following the argument wherever it led, a belief that the examined life was the only one worth living. But Plato also saw the dangers of this pursuit. Socrates made enemies. His questioning embarrassed powerful men, made them look foolish before their peers and students. His young followers sometimes mimicked his technique without his wisdom or restraint, using it to mock traditional values and authorities. In a city at war, struggling with defeat and political instability, Socrates' relentless questioning seemed to some not the pursuit of wisdom, but the undermining of all certainty and authority. The old accusation against sophists that they corrupted the youth began to be whispered about Socrates as well. Yet Socrates continued his mission, undeterred by hostility or danger. He believed he had been given a divine calling to be a gadfly to Athens, to sting the city into self-examination, to rouse it from the slumber of unthinking convention. Plato watched and learned, seeing in his master a model of philosophical courage that would haunt and inspire him for the rest of his life. During these years, Athens's fortunes grew increasingly desperate. The long war with Sparta was approaching its catastrophic conclusion. In 405 BC, the Athenian fleet was destroyed at Aegospotami. The following year, after a brutal siege, Athens surrendered. The victorious Spartans tore down the long walls that had protected the city's connection to its port at Piraeus. Democracy was suspended, and a brutal oligarchy known as the 30 Tyrants was installed, backed by Spartan power. Among these tyrants were men Plato knew well, his mother's relatives Critias and Charmides. These men, some of whom had been associates or students of Socrates, instituted a reign of terror. They executed 1,500 Athenian democrats, confiscated property, and exiled thousands. For 8 months, Athens lived under tyranny. Plato, still a young man in his early 20s, witnessed all this. He saw his city humiliated, democracy overthrown, and men he knew personally wielding power with ruthless brutality. Some sources suggest that the 30 invited Plato to join their government, perhaps because of his family connections or his known association with Socrates. If so, he declined. Perhaps he was already disturbed by their methods. Perhaps Socrates' influence had taught him to question the legitimacy of rule based purely on power. Or perhaps he simply sensed that their regime could not last. Whatever his reasons, Plato stood apart, watching the tragedy unfold. Chapter 3: The Death of Socrates. In 403 BC, democratic forces returned from exile and overthrew the 30 tyrants in a brief but bloody civil war. Democracy was restored, and remarkably, a general amnesty was declared. The city, exhausted by war and internal strife, sought reconciliation. Old wounds were to be forgotten, but Athens had changed. The defeat, the tyranny, the civil war had left scars. The restored democracy was nervous, suspicious, eager to reassert traditional values against those it perceived as undermining them. Into this atmosphere of restoration and anxiety, Socrates continued his philosophical mission as if nothing had changed. He still questioned, still examined, still showed that the confident assertions of respected citizens rested on shaky foundations. In 399 BC, 4 years after the restoration of democracy, 3 Athenian citizens brought formal charges against Socrates. Miletus, a poet, Anytus, a wealthy tanner and politician, and Lycon, a rhetorician, accused Socrates of 2 crimes: failing to acknowledge the gods recognized by the city, introducing new deities, and corrupting the youth of Athens. The charges were vague, deliberately so. They could encompass all the ways Socrates had annoyed, embarrassed, and troubled his fellow citizens over the decades. The unspoken charges were perhaps more serious: association with Critias and other anti-democratic figures, questioning traditional values at a time when the city desperately wanted to reaffirm them, being different, difficult, unsettling in a city that craved stability. For Plato, now 28 years old, the trial was a nightmare. The man he revered above all others, the wisest and most just person he knew, stood accused before a jury of 500 Athenian citizens. The trial, as Plato would later recreate it in his dialogue, The Apology, was less a legal proceeding than a confrontation between 2 visions of life. The accusers represented conventional Athens, the city of tradition, civic religion, and democratic certainty. Socrates represented the examined life, the life of questioning and self-scrutiny, the refusal to accept any belief without rational justification. Socrates defended himself, but characteristically, he did not apologize or plead. Instead, he explained and justified his life's work. He told the jury that his philosophical mission was a service to Athens, that he was like a gadfly sent by the gods to rouse a sluggish horse. He insisted that he had never intentionally corrupted anyone, that if any young men were harmed by his influence, it was unintentional, and their relatives should be in court testifying against him. He remained defiant, even arrogant in the eyes of some jurors, refusing to show the kind of humility or regret that might have swayed them. The jury voted, and by a relatively narrow margin, found Socrates guilty. Under Athenian law, both prosecution and defense could propose a penalty, and the jury would choose between them. The prosecutors proposed death. Socrates, again refusing to play by the expected rules, proposed that he should be maintained at public expense in the Prytaneum, an honor reserved for great benefactors of the city. Only after his friends convinced him did he offer to pay a modest fine. The jury, offended by what seemed like mockery, voted for death by an even larger margin. Plato was present at the trial. Generations later, he would name himself, in his account of it, one of those who offered to help pay the fine. He watched his teacher condemned to death by the city Socrates had served and tried to improve. The shock of it, the injustice as Plato saw it, would shape everything he later wrote and thought. How could the wisest man be condemned by democratic vote? What did this say about democracy itself? About the nature of justice? About the relationship between the philosopher and the city? Under Athenian law, executions could not be carried out during certain religious festivals. Socrates spent 30 days in prison while Athens celebrated the annual festival honoring Apollo. During this time, his friends and students visited him daily. One of them, Crito, arranged for Socrates to escape. Guards had been bribed. A ship was ready. Friends in other cities would welcome and protect him. Socrates refused. In a conversation Plato would later immortalize in the dialogue Crito, Socrates explained that escaping would be unjust. He had lived his entire life in Athens, accepted its laws, and benefited from them. To break them now, even to save his life, would be to betray everything he believed about justice and the social contract. It would be to act from fear rather than principle, exactly the kind of unexamined, emotion-driven behavior he had spent his life combating. His friends wept, but Socrates remained serene, certain that he was doing the right thing. On the final day, a larger group gathered in Socrates' cell. Plato was not among them. Ancient sources tell us that Plato was ill, unable to attend. We can only speculate whether this illness was physical or whether the young man simply could not bear to witness what was about to happen. Those who were present reported what occurred. Socrates spent his last hours in philosophical conversation, discussing the immortality of the soul and the nature of death. He remained calm, even cheerful, comforting his weeping friends more than they comforted him. When the jailer brought the cup of hemlock, the poison used for executions in Athens, Socrates took it without hesitation. He asked if he could pour a libation to the gods, and when told there was only enough for the required dose, he drank it down. The poison, a concoction of plants from the hemlock family, took effect gradually. Socrates walked around until his legs grew heavy, then lay down. Slowly, the numbness spread through his body. His last words, according to those present, were addressed to Crito. "We owe a rooster. Asclepius, do not forget to pay the debt." Then he was gone. For Plato, the death of Socrates was the defining trauma of his life. The man he loved and admired most had been killed by the Athenian democracy, killed for trying to make Athens better, for questioning and examining and seeking truth. How does one respond to such an injustice? How does one continue when the world has shown itself so profoundly wrong? Plato's response would unfold over decades, in journeys and dialogues and the founding of a school. But it began with a decision to flee Athens. He could not stay in the city that had killed his master. The world needed to understand what had happened, needed to see Socrates as he truly was. And Plato himself needed time to think, to travel, to begin the long process of transforming grief and rage into philosophy. Chapter 4. The Years of Wandering. After Socrates' death, Plato left Athens. Ancient sources tell us he first went to Megara, a short distance from Athens, where another student of Socrates, Euclid, had established a school. There, in the company of other grieving disciples, Plato began to process what had happened. The conversations must have been intense, filled with memories of their master, attempts to understand why Athens had condemned him, discussions of what it meant to continue his mission. But Plato could not remain static. The loss of Socrates had left a void that could only be filled by seeking something beyond what Athens offered. He needed to see more of the world, to learn from other traditions, to find answers to questions that now burned within him about justice, politics, and the nature of reality itself. Plato's travels over the next 12 years are somewhat shrouded in legend and uncertainty, but the broad outlines are accepted by most historians. He journeyed extensively through the Greek world and beyond. Ancient sources place him in Cyrene, in North Africa, where he may have studied mathematics with Theodorus, a philosopher and mathematician who would later appear as a character in Plato's dialogues. Mathematics, with its certainty and eternal truths, must have appealed powerfully to a man shaken by the instability and injustice of political life. He traveled to Egypt, where Greek intellectuals had long gone to study ancient wisdom. Egypt possessed knowledge preserved over millennia, astronomical observations, geometrical techniques, religious traditions that predated Greek civilization. What Plato learned in Egypt is unclear, but the experience of encountering a culture so ancient and so different from his own surely broadened his perspective. The most significant of Plato's journeys, however, were to southern Italy and Sicily, the regions known as Magna Graecia, Greater Greece. Here, Greek colonies had flourished for centuries, developing their own distinctive cultures and intellectual traditions. In southern Italy, Plato encountered the Pythagorean communities. Pythagoras, the legendary mathematician and philosopher who had died about a century before Plato's birth, had established a way of life combining mathematics, music theory, religious mysticism, and communal living. The Pythagoreans believed that reality at its deepest level was mathematical, that numbers and their relationships were the key to understanding the cosmos. They practiced asceticism and followed strict rules of conduct. Some of their doctrines struck outsiders as strange: their belief in reincarnation, their prohibition on eating beans, their secretive practices. But their intellectual achievements were undeniable. Plato met with Pythagorean philosophers, including Archytas of Tarentum, who was both a brilliant mathematician and a successful political leader. Archytas embodied something Plato desperately sought: a philosopher who could Also, govern wisely, who could apply theoretical wisdom to practical politics. The conversations between Plato and Archytas must have ranged across mathematics, cosmology, and political theory. From the Pythagoreans, Plato absorbed ideas that would become central to his own philosophy: the immortality of the soul, the importance of mathematics for understanding reality, the possibility of applying philosophical wisdom to the organization of society. Yet he also saw the limitations and failures of Pythagorean communities, their occasional fanaticism, the way their doctrines could become dogmatic, their vulnerability to persecution by more conventional citizens who distrusted their strange ways. While in Sicily, Plato visited Syracuse, the most powerful Greek city in the Western Mediterranean. There he met Dion, a young nobleman who would become his friend and disciple. Dion was brother-in-law to Dionysius I, the tyrant who ruled Syracuse with absolute power. Plato, apparently, also encountered the tyrant himself, though the meeting did not go well. Dionysius was a cultured man who patronized poets and artists, but he was also ruthless in maintaining his power. Plato, carrying the trauma of Socrates' death and his own evolving ideas about justice and politics, could hardly have approved of rule by tyranny, however enlightened the tyrant claimed to be. Legend says that Plato offended Dionysius and was either expelled from Syracuse or sold into slavery, only to be ransomed by friends. The details are murky, but what matters is that Plato's first encounter with political power in Syracuse was a failure. During these years of travel, Plato was not merely learning from others, he was also writing. The earliest of his dialogues, the works we call the Socratic dialogues, were composed in this period: the Euthyphro, the Apology, the Crito. These were Plato's attempt to capture Socrates, to show the world what Athens had destroyed. They are vivid, dramatic, filled with the personality of Socrates and the cut and thrust of his dialectical method. In writing them, Plato was creating a new literary form, the philosophical dialogue, a work that was simultaneously drama, argument, and character study. These early dialogues typically end without definitive answers. Socrates asks what courage is, or what piety is, and the discussion reveals that the interlocutor does not really know, but no positive definition is established. This reflects the Socratic method at its purest, the exposure of ignorance as the first step toward wisdom. But Plato was beginning to move beyond merely recording Socrates' method. His own philosophical vision was starting to take shape. The question of how to live justly in an unjust world, the problem of how Athens could have condemned its wisest citizen, these led Plato toward larger questions. What is justice itself? Not just what people call justice in Athens or Syracuse or anywhere else, but what is the eternal, unchanging nature of justice? Does such a thing exist? If so, where? How can we know it? These questions were pulling Plato toward the development of his theory of forms, the doctrine that would become his most distinctive contribution to philosophy. But that theory was still gestating during the years of wandering. Plato was still a young man, still grieving, still searching. Chapter 5: The Return and the Founding of the Academy. Around 387 BC, after 12 years of travel and study, Plato returned to Athens. He was 40 years old, no longer the young disciple who had fled after Socrates' death, but a mature thinker with his own vision. The Athens he returned to was changed as well. The trauma of defeat and civil war had receded somewhat. The democracy was functioning, though less confidently than in Pericles' day. The city had lost its empire, but retained its cultural prestige. It was still the place where any serious philosopher had to establish himself if he wanted to influence Greek thought. Plato had learned much from his travels, but he knew that Athens, for all its flaws, was where his work belonged. Yet he also knew that he could not pursue philosophy the way Socrates had. Walking the streets, engaging random passers-by in conversation, that had led to disaster. A new approach was needed. Plato purchased property in a grove sacred to the hero, Academus, located about a mile outside Athens' city walls. The location was beautiful, shaded by olive and plane trees, with gardens and gymnasia nearby. It was also significant. The grove was already associated with intellectual activity, a place where sophists and philosophers had gathered to teach and converse. By establishing himself there, Plato was claiming a space for philosophy, creating an institution that could survive beyond any individual's lifetime. He called it the Academy, after the sacred grove. It would become the world's first university, an institution dedicated to research and teaching that would endure for 900 years. The founding of the Academy was a radical act. Previous philosophers had taught individually, gathering students around them but creating no lasting institution. The sophists sold their teachings to whoever would pay, but established no schools. Plato envisioned something different, a community of scholars dedicated to the cooperative pursuit of truth, where knowledge would be shared freely, where students could become teachers, where the flame of philosophy would be passed from generation to generation. The Academy was not a school in the modern sense. There were no formal curricula, no degrees, no rigid structure. But there were subjects of study, mathematics and astronomy, dialectic and philosophy, political theory and natural science. Plato presided over the Academy not as a dictator, but as a guide, setting the tone and direction while allowing remarkable freedom of inquiry. One of the first things Plato did was establish a shrine to the Muses, the 9 goddesses of learning and the arts, in the Academy's gardens. This was both a practical and symbolic act. As a place dedicated to the Muses, the Academy could claim religious protection, important in a city that could be suspicious of philosophers. But more deeply, the shrine represented Plato's vision of what learning should be: inspired, creative, a kind of worship. Philosophy was not just about analyzing arguments. It was about ascending toward divine truths, about the love of wisdom that transformed the soul. The teaching methods at the Academy combined lectures, dialogues, and collaborative research. Plato did not simply deliver doctrines to be memorized. Instead, he engaged students in the kind of philosophical investigation Socrates had practiced, asking questions, examining assumptions, following arguments to their conclusions. But Plato also went beyond Socrates. He believed that certain truths could be established, that knowledge was possible, and that the method for achieving it involved both dialectic and mathematics. Mathematics was central to the Academy's curriculum. According to legend, above the entrance was inscribed, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here." Whether this inscription existed or not, the sentiment was genuine. Plato believed that studying mathematics was essential preparation for philosophy. Mathematics revealed a realm of perfect eternal truths that existed independently of the physical world. The truths of geometry did not change with political upheavals or personal opinions. They were not matters of convention, but of insight into eternal forms. By training the mind in mathematical reasoning, students prepared themselves for the more difficult ascent to philosophical wisdom. At the academy, mathematicians and philosophers worked together. Theaetetus, one of the greatest geometers of the age, was associated with the academy. Eudoxus, who made crucial advances in mathematics and astronomy, came from Asia Minor to study and teach there. The academy became a center not just of philosophy, but of scientific inquiry. Astronomical observations were made, mathematical problems were posed and solved, investigations into the natural world were conducted. In this, Plato was creating the model for the research university, a place where knowledge in all fields was pursued simultaneously, where different disciplines could inform and enrich each other. But philosophy remained at the heart of the enterprise. And philosophy for Plato meant, above all, understanding the forms. This doctrine, which Plato developed most fully in the Middle Dialogues, written during the Academy's early years, held that beyond the changing, imperfect world of sense experience exists a realm of eternal, perfect forms or ideas. The form of beauty is perfect beauty itself, unchanging and eternal. The form of justice is perfect justice. Every beautiful thing we encounter in the physical world is beautiful only because it participates in or imitates the form of beauty. Every just action is just because it reflects the form of justice. Plato believed that true knowledge was knowledge of the forms, not of the shifting appearances of the sensible world. This theory explained how certain knowledge was possible despite the flux and change of physical reality. It explained how mathematical truths could be eternal and universal. It provided a foundation for ethics. There was an eternal, objective good that did not vary with human opinion or convention. And it offered hope to those, like Plato, traumatized by the injustice and irrationality of politics. Even if Athens condemned Socrates, there existed a realm of perfect justice that Athens' actions could not touch or change. Chapter 6: The Philosopher and Political Power. Even as Plato built the academy and developed his philosophical doctrines, he could not entirely leave politics behind. The question that haunted him: how can philosophers improve actual cities? How can wisdom be brought to bear on political power? Continued to trouble him. The Republic, the great dialogue Plato wrote during this period, explores these questions through the construction of an ideal city in speech. The dialogue imagines a perfectly just city, ruled not by tyrants or democratic assemblies, but by philosopher kings, individuals who through long education and natural ability have come to know the forms, and especially the form of the good. Only such individuals, Plato argued, should rule, because only they possess the wisdom necessary to govern justly. The Republic is a masterpiece of philosophical imagination, but it also reveals Plato's frustration with actual politics. His ideal city requires nearly impossible conditions: rulers who do not desire power, a population willing to accept radical inequality, an educational system that can reliably produce philosopher kings, the complete subordination of individual desires to the common good. Plato knew this city was unlikely to exist. In the dialogue, Socrates himself admits that it exists perhaps only as a pattern in heaven, a model to guide individual souls rather than an actual blueprint for political reform. Yet Plato could not quite abandon the hope that philosophy might transform politics, not in some distant future, but in his own lifetime. When the opportunity arose to try, he could not refuse. In 367 BC, when Plato was about 60 years old, Dionysius I, the tyrant of Syracuse whom Plato had met decades earlier, died. His son, Dionysius II, inherited power. Dion, Plato's friend and now brother-in-law to the young tyrant, saw an opportunity. Dionysius II was young, not yet hardened into tyranny. Perhaps he could be educated, transformed into a philosopher king. Dion wrote to Plato, urging him to come to Syracuse and undertake the education of the new ruler. Other friends, including the Pythagorean philosopher Archytas, added their pleas. Here, they argued, was a chance to put philosophy into practice, to prove that wisdom could guide power. Plato was deeply conflicted. He was 60, established in Athens, presiding over a flourishing academy. Syracuse was far away, the political situation uncertain. Dionysius II might prove as hostile to philosophy as his father. Yet how could Plato refuse? He had argued all his adult life that philosophers should not remain aloof from politics, that they had a duty to try to improve the cities in which they lived. If he declined this invitation, would he not be proving that his entire philosophical project was mere idle speculation, beautiful in theory, but useless in practice? Plato later wrote, in what is known as his seventh letter, that he went to Syracuse not with enthusiasm, but because he could not bear to be merely a theorist, all talk and no action. He went despite his doubts, knowing that the chances of success were slim, because to refuse would be to betray his own principles. The journey to Syracuse was a disaster from the start. Dionysius II was interested in philosophy, but in a superficial way. He wanted the prestige of having a famous philosopher at his court, wanted to impress visitors with his learning, but he did not want to do the hard work of genuine philosophical education. He was jealous of Dion's influence and suspicious of any challenge to his absolute power. Plato tried to establish a curriculum of study, beginning with mathematics and geometry, to discipline the young tyrant's mind. But Dionysius lacked patience and commitment. He wanted quick answers to political questions, not years of preparation in abstract reasoning. Worse, the political intrigue at the Syracusan court was intense. Dionysius's advisors saw Dion and Plato as threats. They whispered accusations, suggested that Dion was plotting to seize power, implied that Plato was undermining the tyrant's authority. Dionysius, insecure and suspicious, listened. Relations deteriorated rapidly. Within months, Dionysius expelled Dion from Syracuse, confiscating his property and separating him from his family. Plato found himself in an impossible position. He could not accomplish his mission without Dion, his ally, and the link to the tyrant. But Dionysius, perhaps genuinely interested in learning despite his limitations, perhaps merely wanting to keep Plato as an ornament of his court, would not let the philosopher leave. Plato was essentially held as a guest who could not depart, honored but constrained, increasingly aware that his presence was accomplishing nothing. Through the intervention of Archytas and other friends, Plato was finally allowed to return to Athens after about a year. He came back having achieved nothing, his hope of creating a philosopher king crushed by the realities of tyranny and court politics. The experience should have taught Plato that philosophy and political power do not easily mix, that tyrants do not become philosophers simply because a philosopher talks to them. Yet the lesson did not fully take. Years later, in 361 BC, when Plato was 67, Dionysius II invited him back to Syracuse. The tyrant promised reconciliation with Dion, claimed he was now ready to study seriously. Against the advice of friends and his own better judgment, Plato went again. This second visit was even worse than the first. Dionysius had no intention of reconciling with Dion or pursuing genuine philosophy. He wanted Plato's presence for prestige while continuing his tyrannical rule. Plato was again held in Syracuse, unable to leave without permission. The situation became dangerous. At one point, Plato's life may have been in danger from mercenary soldiers angry about delayed pay, with Plato somehow caught in the political turmoil. Finally, through urgent appeals from Archytas, Plato was allowed to return to Athens. He came back knowing that his dream of uniting philosophy and political power, at least in Syracuse, was finished. Dion, frustrated and bitter, would later raise an army and invade Syracuse in 357 BC, briefly seizing power before being assassinated by former allies. The entire Syracusan adventure ended in failure, exile, and murder. Plato had risked his life and reputation twice and accomplished nothing. The philosopher king remained a beautiful impossibility, a pattern in heaven that no earthly city could embody. These failures in Syracuse profoundly affected Plato's later thought. His last great political dialogue, The Laws, abandons the radical idealism of the Republic. Instead of philosopher kings, it describes a more practical, though still idealistic, constitutional system, mixing democratic and aristocratic elements, governed by detailed laws rather than the wisdom of perfect rulers. The Laws is the work of a man who has learned through bitter experience that human nature and political reality resist philosophical transformation. Yet even in his 80s, writing The Laws, Plato did not entirely abandon hope. The dialogue still insists that education and virtue must be central to any good political order, still believes that reason can guide the organization of society, still holds that the unexamined life is not worth living. Plato's failures in Syracuse refined, but did not destroy his faith in philosophy's importance for politics. He simply became more realistic about what could be achieved, more aware of the gap between theory and practice, more willing to compromise with human imperfection while still holding fast to eternal ideals. Chapter 7. The Teacher and His Students. While Plato's political adventures ended in failure, his work at the academy flourished beyond anything he might have imagined. For 40 years, from its founding in 387 BC until his death in 347 BC, Plato presided over the academy, teaching, writing, and guiding what became the most influential philosophical school of antiquity. Students came from across the Greek world to study with him. Some stayed for a few years, others for decades. Many went on to become philosophers, statesmen, scientists, and educators in their own right, spreading Platonic ideas throughout the Hellenistic world. The academy was unusual for its time in that it welcomed not just freeborn Greek men, but also women. Axiothea of Phlius, a female philosopher, is said to have studied at the academy, as did Lasthenia of Mantinea. This openness to women students was rare in ancient Greece, though less surprising given Plato's arguments in the Republic that women could be as capable as men in philosophy and governance. The teaching at the academy was rigorous and wide-ranging. Mathematics remained fundamental. Students worked through geometric proofs, studied astronomical theories, engaged with the latest developments in mathematical reasoning. But the ultimate goal was always philosophical. Mathematics was propedeutic, preparatory for the ascent to dialectic and the knowledge of forms. The advanced students engaged in dialectical exercises, learning to construct and demolish arguments, to follow reasoning wherever it led, to recognize fallacies and contradictions. Plato himself led many of these discussions, though he also encouraged students to work independently and to question even his own doctrines. The academy was not a place of indoctrination, but of inquiry. Plato believed that truth could not be simply transmitted like facts to be memorized. Each person had to discover it through their own intellectual effort, guided by teachers, but ultimately relying on the power of their own reason. The most famous student of the academy, and ultimately its most important, was Aristotle. He arrived in 367 BC at age 17 and remained for 20 years until Plato's death. The relationship between teacher and student was complex. Aristotle revered Plato, calling him the man whom it is blasphemy for bad men even to praise. Yet Aristotle was no mere follower. From early on, he questioned and challenged Platonic doctrines. He found the theory of forms problematic, asking where exactly these forms existed, how they related to physical objects, whether positing them really explained anything or just pushed the problem back a step. Plato tolerated and even encouraged this critical engagement. According to later accounts, he nicknamed Aristotle the Mind for his intellectual brilliance and said that while other students needed the spur, Aristotle needed the bridle. His mind was so active and quick. The philosophical differences between Plato and Aristotle would become famous, symbolizing two fundamental approaches to philosophy. Plato's gaze was directed upward, toward eternal forms beyond the physical world. Aristotle's was directed at the physical world itself, seeking to understand it through empirical observation and systematic classification. Plato was a rationalist and idealist. Aristotle was an empiricist and naturalist. Yet these differences developed gradually and never became a complete break during Plato's lifetime. At the Academy, the two greatest minds of Greek philosophy worked in creative tension, each pushing the other to sharpen and develop their ideas. When Plato died, Aristotle did not become head of the Academy. That position went to Plato's nephew, Speusippus. Some historians suggest Aristotle was disappointed that he left Athens partly because he was passed over. Others argue that Aristotle's philosophical differences with the direction Speusippus took the Academy made his departure inevitable. Whatever the reason, Aristotle left and eventually founded his own school, the Lyceum, which became the Academy's great rival. The two schools represented the two main streams of Greek philosophy, Platonic idealism and Aristotelian empiricism, and their debates and competition enriched both traditions. But this was all in the future. During Plato's lifetime, the Academy was the undisputed center of Greek philosophy, attracting the best minds of each generation. Among the other notable students were Eudoxus, the mathematician and astronomer, who developed a sophisticated model of planetary motion, Speusippus, who succeeded Plato as head of the Academy, Xenocrates, who became the third head of the Academy, and numerous others who went on to establish schools and influence political life throughout the Greek world. The Academy was not isolated from Athens. Its members participated in the city's intellectual life, engaged with other philosophical schools, debated the sophists, attended theatrical performances, and involved themselves in political discussions. Plato himself, despite his disillusionment with Athenian democracy, remained a citizen of Athens and took some role in civic affairs. He is said to have provided advice on legal and constitutional matters when asked, though he never held political office or sought to lead the democratic assembly. His political influence was exercised through his students, many of whom did become active in politics, bringing Platonic ideas to bear on the governance of various Greek cities. The Academy also served as a kind of research institute. Members conducted observations of celestial phenomena, worked on mathematical problems, collected information about different political constitutions and legal systems from across the Greek world. This empirical research, combined with philosophical reflection, produced works that were both theoretical and practical, exploring eternal questions while remaining engaged with the concrete realities of human life. In all this, Plato's presence was central. He was not simply an administrator or lecturer, but a living embodiment of the philosophical life. Students at the academy saw in him a model of what it meant to pursue wisdom, to live according to reason, to subordinate personal desires to the search for truth. Plato lived simply, devoted his time to philosophy and teaching, and maintained the kind of examined life that Socrates had preached. His personal example may have taught more powerfully than any of his doctrines. Chapter 8: The Dialogues as Living Philosophy. While teaching at the academy and engaging in political adventures, Plato was also writing. The dialogues he composed over his long career represent one of the supreme achievements of Western literature and philosophy. Unlike most philosophical works, which present arguments directly in the author's voice, Plato's dialogues are dramatic conversations among characters, usually featuring Socrates as the main speaker. This form was not accidental, but central to Plato's philosophical method. He believed that philosophy could not be captured in doctrines to be memorized, but had to be lived, experienced as a process of inquiry. The dialogue form allowed readers to participate in philosophical investigation, to follow arguments as they developed, to experience the puzzles and insights that arose in genuine conversation. The dialogues Plato wrote can be roughly divided into 3 periods, though the exact chronology is debated by scholars. Early dialogues, written in the years after Socrates' death, focus on ethical questions and the Socratic method. They typically end without positive conclusions, demonstrating the limits of conventional wisdom, but not replacing it with systematic doctrine. The Euthyphro asks what piety is, the Laches what courage is, the Charmides what temperance is. In each case, confident claims are examined and found wanting, but no definitive answer is provided. These dialogues preserve Socrates' legacy, showing how he questioned and examined, how he exposed the ignorance hiding beneath claims to knowledge. The middle dialogues, written during Plato's mature years at the academy, develop the theory of forms and present a positive philosophical vision. The Phaedo explores the immortality of the soul and introduces the forms as eternal objects of knowledge. The Symposium examines the nature of love and beauty, presenting a ladder of ascent from physical beauty to the form of beauty itself. The Republic, Plato's longest and most famous work, uses the construction of an ideal city as a way of exploring justice, education, metaphysics, and the nature of reality. These dialogues are philosophical masterpieces, combining rigorous argument with literary artistry, using myths and images to convey truths that resist purely rational exposition. The late dialogues show Plato revisiting and sometimes criticizing his earlier doctrines. The Parmenides subjects the theory of forms to devastating logical examination, raising questions Plato himself may not have fully resolved. The Theaetetus explores the nature of knowledge without arriving at a definitive account. The sophist and statesman refine the method of dialectic and explore political philosophy from new angles. The Timaeus presents a cosmological myth, a speculative account of how the physical universe was created by a divine craftsman using the forms as models. And the Laws, Plato's last and longest work, develops a detailed, legal code for a more realistic, less idealistic city than the Republic had imagined. Throughout all these dialogues, certain themes recur. The distinction between appearance and reality, between the shifting world of sense experience and the eternal realm of forms. The priority of the soul over the body, of reason over appetite, of knowledge over opinion. The insistence that virtue is a kind of knowledge, that to know the good is to do it, that evil arises from ignorance rather than malice. The belief that philosophy is not just an intellectual exercise, but a way of life, a practice that transforms the soul and prepares it for eternity. The conviction that ultimate reality is rational, orderly, and good, even if the visible world is full of injustice and suffering. Plato's literary skill in these dialogues is extraordinary. He creates vivid characters, from the pompous sophist Protagoras to the tragic figure of Socrates in the Phaedo, calmly discussing immortality while awaiting execution. He uses humor, irony, myth, and dramatic tension to engage readers and make philosophical arguments memorable. The dialogues are not dry academic treatises, but living works of art that continue to be read not just by specialists, but by anyone interested in fundamental questions about reality, knowledge, ethics, and the meaning of existence. One striking feature of the dialogues is that Plato himself never appears as a character and never speaks in his own voice. We hear Socrates, Parmenides, the Eleatic stranger, various sophists and students, but never Plato. This reticence is deliberate. Plato wanted his readers to engage with arguments and ideas, not to simply accept doctrines on authority. By hiding behind his characters, especially Socrates, Plato forced readers to think for themselves, to evaluate arguments on their merits, to participate actively in philosophical inquiry rather than passively receiving wisdom. This strategy has created endless scholarly debate about what Plato actually believed. Do the arguments put in Socrates' mouth in the Republic represent Plato's views, or are they positions to be examined and questioned? When later dialogues criticize the theory of forms, is Plato rejecting his earlier doctrine or refining it? These questions may be unanswerable, and perhaps deliberately so. Plato may have believed that philosophy could not be captured in fixed doctrines, that each person had to work through the questions for themselves. The dialogues provide not answers, but starting points for inquiry, provocations to thought, rather than conclusions to accept. In this sense, Plato's literary form embodied his deepest philosophical commitments. Philosophy was not a body of knowledge to transmit, but a way of life to practice, not a set of conclusions to memorize, but a process of questioning to engage in. The dialogues were tools for awakening the soul, for turning it from the shadows of the cave toward the light of truth, for beginning the ascent from appearance to reality, from opinion to knowledge, from the love of beautiful bodies to the vision of beauty itself. Chapter 9. The Theory of Forms and the Divided Line. At the heart of Plato's mature philosophy stands the theory of forms, also called the theory of ideas, a doctrine so influential that it has shaped all subsequent Western philosophy. Understanding this theory is essential to grasping Plato's entire worldview, his metaphysics and epistemology, his ethics and politics, even his views on art and education. The basic idea is deceptively simple, yet profound in its implications. Plato argued that the physical world we perceive through our senses is not ultimate reality, but a realm of imperfect copies or shadows. Behind or above this world of appearances exists a realm of perfect, eternal, unchanging forms. These forms are the true objects of knowledge, the ultimate realities that give meaning and structure to everything else. Consider beautiful things in the physical world: a beautiful person, a beautiful sunset, a beautiful painting. Each is beautiful, but their beauty is imperfect and temporary. The person ages, the sunset fades, the painting deteriorates. Moreover, people disagree about what is beautiful. What appears beautiful to one person may seem ugly to another. There seems to be no objective standard by which to judge beauty in the physical world. But Plato argued that all these beautiful things are beautiful because they participate in or imitate the form of beauty itself, perfect beauty that exists eternally, unchanged by time or opinion. This form is not a physical object, but an abstract reality, intelligible rather than sensible, grasped by the mind rather than the senses. The same applies to all qualities and concepts. There is a form of justice, a form of courage, a form of equality. There are forms for natural kinds as well, a form of horse that makes all individual horses horses, a form of tree that all trees imperfectly embody. Even mathematical entities like circles and triangles exist as perfect forms, which physical circles and triangles merely approximate. The forms are eternal, they exist outside of time, unchanging and indestructible. They are perfect, possessing the qualities they represent in their pure, undiluted essence. They are objective, existing independently of human thought or perception. And they are hierarchical, with the form of the good at the apex, the source and principle of all other forms. Knowledge of the forms is the highest kind of knowledge, genuine episteme, rather than mere doxa or opinion. Sense perception can give us only beliefs about the changing physical world, beliefs that may be more or less accurate, but never achieve the certainty of true knowledge. True knowledge is of eternal truths, the kind of understanding we have in mathematics when we grasp that the angles of a triangle always sum to 180 degrees, not by measuring physical triangles, but by understanding the form of triangle itself. But how do we gain knowledge of forms if we cannot perceive them with our senses? Plato's answer involves the theory of recollection or anamnesis. He suggested that the soul existed before birth in the realm of forms, where it beheld these perfect realities directly. At birth, when the soul enters a physical body, it forgets this knowledge. But through philosophical inquiry and dialectic, especially aided by the study of mathematics, the soul can recollect what it once knew, can ascend from sensible particulars to intelligible forms. In the Republic, Plato illustrates these ideas with powerful images. The most famous is the allegory of the cave. Imagine prisoners chained in a cave, facing a wall, unable to turn their heads. Behind them burns a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners, people carry objects that cast shadows on the wall the prisoners face. The prisoners, having seen nothing but these shadows all their lives, take them to be reality. If one prisoner were freed, turned around, and forced to look at the fire and the objects casting shadows, he would be confused and pained by the light. If he were then dragged up out of the cave into the sunlight, he would be even more overwhelmed. But gradually, his eyes would adjust. He would come to see the real world, the trees and mountains and sky, and finally the sun itself, the source of all light and life. This allegory represents the soul's journey from ignorance to knowledge. The shadows are the imperfect physical objects we perceive with our senses. The objects casting shadows are the forms. The fire is a lesser source of illumination, perhaps representing mathematical reasoning. The sun outside the cave is the form of the good, the ultimate reality that makes all knowledge possible, that illuminates all other forms, just as the sun illuminates all visible objects. The freed prisoner who ascends from cave to sunlight is the philosopher, who, through education and dialectic, rises from sense perception to knowledge of forms to finally glimpsing the good itself. Plato also uses the image of the divided line to illustrate levels of reality and corresponding levels of knowledge. The line is divided into two main sections, the visible realm and the intelligible realm. The visible realm is further divided into images, shadows, and reflections, and physical objects. The intelligible realm is divided into mathematical objects and forms. Each level of reality corresponds to a mental state, imagination for images, belief for physical objects, thought for mathematical reasoning, and understanding or noesis for knowledge of forms. Only the highest level constitutes genuine knowledge. Everything below it is opinion or mere calculation. These doctrines raise obvious questions, and Plato was aware of many of them. If there are forms for qualities like beauty and justice, are there also forms for trivial things like mud or hair? Aristotle famously mocked the idea of a form of bed. Where exactly do the forms exist? In what sense do physical objects participate in forms? How can eternal, unchanging forms be the cause of motion and change in the physical world? The late dialogue Parmenides raises many of these objections, suggesting Plato himself recognized difficulties in his theory. Yet despite these problems, the theory of forms provided powerful answers to questions that mattered deeply to Plato. It explained how knowledge was possible in a changing world. It grounded ethics in objective reality rather than subjective preference. It offered hope that beyond the injustice and chaos of political life existed eternal justice and good. And it gave philosophy a grand purpose, the ascent from opinion to knowledge, from shadows to reality, from the cave to the sunlight. Chapter 10: The Soul and Its Immortality. Closely connected to the theory of forms is Plato's doctrine of the soul, its nature, its relationship to the body, and its immortality. These ideas were not merely abstract metaphysics for Plato, but had profound practical implications for how one should live. If the soul is immortal and more real than the body, then caring for the soul becomes the most important human task. If the soul existed before birth and will continue after death, then what we do in this life takes on cosmic significance. Plato's fullest account of the soul appears in the Republic and the Phaedo. He argues that the soul has three parts: reason, spirit, or thumos, and appetite. Reason is the part that calculates, deliberates, and seeks truth. Spirit is the part concerned with honor, courage, and righteous anger. Appetite is the part that desires physical pleasures, food, drink, sex, and comfort. These three parts often conflict. Reason may tell us to study philosophy, but appetite wants to eat and sleep, while spirit may be inflamed by some perceived insult and demand we seek revenge. Justice in the soul, Plato argues, consists in these three parts performing their proper functions in harmony, with reason ruling, spirit supporting reason's rule, and appetite obeying. This internal harmony mirrors the structure of the just city in the Republic, where philosopher kings rule, guardians protect, and workers produce. The analogy is not accidental. For Plato, political justice and psychological justice are fundamentally the same thing, the proper ordering of parts under the rule of wisdom. But why should reason rule? Because reason alone can grasp eternal truths, can know the forms, especially the form of the good. The good life for a human being involves the soul becoming as much like the eternal forms as possible, ordered, harmonious, unchanging in its commitment to truth and goodness. The body, with its endless changing desires and physical needs, pulls the soul downward toward the realm of becoming and decay. Philosophy is the practice of separating the soul from the body's influence, of training it to focus on eternal realities. This is why Plato, following Socrates, insists that philosophy is practice for dying. Death is the ultimate separation of soul from body, and the philosopher prepares for this by living as if already partially freed from bodily concerns. The immortality of the soul is argued for in several dialogues, most fully in the Phaedo. Plato offers multiple arguments. One is based on the theory of recollection. If we can recall knowledge we did not learn in this life, our souls must have existed before birth and will presumably continue after death. Another appeals to the soul's simplicity. Physical things decay because they are composites that can be broken apart, but the soul, being simple and immaterial, cannot decompose and therefore cannot die. A third argument claims that the soul, as the principle of life, cannot admit death, just as fire cannot admit cold. The soul is inherently living and therefore immortal. These arguments are not airtight, and characters in the dialogues raise objections to them. But for Plato, the immortality of the soul was not merely a conclusion of logical proof, but a deep conviction tied to his entire worldview. If philosophy is the highest human activity, if knowing the good is the ultimate goal, then it would be cosmically unjust if this goal could only be pursued for a few decades before death ended everything. The soul's immortality gives point to the philosophical life, makes the pursuit of wisdom a permanent feature of our being, rather than a temporary activity that death renders meaningless. Plato also develops an account of the soul's fate after death, particularly in the myths that end several dialogues. In the Phaedo, the myth of the afterlife describes souls being judged and sent to appropriate destinations based on how they lived. Philosophical souls who purified themselves through the practice of wisdom ascend to dwell with the gods or in a pure realm. Souls that were dominated by bodily pleasures are reincarnated into appropriate animal forms. Gluttons might become donkeys. Violent people might become wolves. In the Republic, the myth of Air tells of a soldier who dies in battle, visits the afterlife, and returns to describe what he saw. Souls, after a period of reward or punishment corresponding to their earthly lives, choose their next incarnation. The choice reveals character. Some choose lives of power and pleasure. Others, lives of obscurity and philosophy. Once chosen, the soul drinks from the river of forgetfulness and is reborn, carrying no memory of its previous existence or the realm of forms it once knew. These myths serve multiple purposes. They make vivid the consequences of how we live, give narrative form to Plato's ethical teachings, and suggest that justice ultimately prevails, if not in this life, then in the next. They also explain the inequality and apparent injustice of earthly life, why some are born into favorable circumstances and others into misery, through the doctrine of karma-like consequences across lifetimes. But most importantly, the myths underscore that the soul is the true self. The body is a temporary vehicle, a prison even, from which the soul will eventually be freed. What matters is not wealth, power, or physical pleasure, but the state of one's soul, whether it is just or unjust, wise or ignorant, oriented toward eternal forms or mired in changing appearances. Philosophy is soul care, the most important activity a human being can undertake. Chapter 11: Education and the Ascent to Wisdom. For Plato, education was not merely the transmission of information or the development of skills, but the reorientation of the entire soul toward truth. The purpose of education was to turn the soul from the darkness of the cave toward the light of the good, to awaken the capacity for knowledge that every human soul possesses, but that remains dormant without proper guidance. This vision of education is most fully developed in the Republic, where Plato outlines a comprehensive educational program for the guardians of his ideal city. The education Plato describes begins in childhood with carefully selected stories and music. Children should hear only stories that promote virtue, that depict the gods and heroes as truly good, that inculcate courage, self-control, and justice. Traditional Greek myths, which often showed gods behaving badly, lying, committing adultery, and being governed by passions, should be censored or rewritten. Point is not to deceive children, but to shape their souls toward the good from the earliest age, before reason is fully developed, and they might be able to critically evaluate what they hear. Music and poetry are similarly important because they bypass the intellect and affect the soul directly, instilling emotional responses and dispositions that will shape character. Physical education develops the body and the spirited part of the soul, but it must be balanced with music and poetry, which cultivate gentleness and harmony. Too much physical training produces people who are brutal and aggressive. Too much music produces people who are soft and weak. The proper balance creates souls that are both courageous and thoughtful, able to defend the city, but also to appreciate beauty and order. As students mature, their education turns to mathematics. This is the crucial transition from opinion to knowledge, from the visible to the intelligible realm. Mathematics trains the soul to think abstractly, to grasp truths that are universal and eternal, to reason logically from premises to conclusions. Students study arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, understood as the mathematical study of celestial motions, and harmonics, the mathematical theory of musical intervals. Each of these disciplines pulls the soul away from sense perception toward pure thought, toward the realm of forms. But mathematics is still preparatory. The numbers and figures studied in mathematics are not the highest forms, but intermediate objects, more abstract than physical things, but not yet the ultimate realities. The final stage of education is dialectic, the practice of philosophical argumentation and inquiry. In dialectic, students learn to question assumptions, to define terms precisely, to follow arguments wherever they lead, to ascend from particular instances to universal principles, and then to see how those principles relate to the highest principle of all, the form of the good. Dialectic is not a separate subject like geometry, but a method, the philosophical practice that Socrates exemplified. Only those who complete this long education, which Plato suggests might take until age 50, are ready to be philosopher kings, to rule the city with wisdom. But even then, their education is not complete. They must descend back into the cave, must turn from contemplation of the good to apply their wisdom to practical governance. This descent is painful. The philosopher, who has seen the sun, must return to darkness, must engage with opinion and politics rather than remaining in the realm of pure knowledge. Yet, it is necessary. Justice requires that those who are capable of ruling do so, even at personal cost. Plato's educational vision is profoundly anti-democratic in some ways. He believes that only a few souls are capable of completing the ascent to wisdom, that most people will remain at the level of opinion, governed by appetite and the shifting appearances of the visible world. But it is also egalitarian in important respects. The selection of future guardians is based not on birth or wealth, but on natural ability and achievement in education. Even children of workers might be elevated to guardian status if they show promise, while children of guardians might be demoted if they lack ability. Women as well as men can become guardians and even philosopher kings if they have the requisite nature and education. The key insight in Plato's educational philosophy is that knowledge is not poured into the soul from outside, but drawn out from within. The teacher is like the midwife Socrates described himself as, not imparting knowledge, but helping the student give birth to understanding that was always potentially present. This is why dialectic, the give and take of question and answer, is so important. It forces students to think for themselves, to discover truths through their own reasoning, rather than accepting them on authority. Education is the awakening of the soul, the turning from shadows to reality. And like waking from sleep, it cannot be forced, but must be gently encouraged, creating conditions where the soul can open its eyes and see. Chapter 12: Art, Poetry, and the Critique of Imitation. One of Plato's most controversial and perplexing doctrines is his critique of poetry and art, articulated most forcefully in the Republic. Plato, who was himself a literary artist of the highest order, argues that poets and painters should be excluded from the ideal city, or at least strictly censored. To understand this apparently paradoxical position, we must see it in the context of his theory of forms and his concerns about education and the health of souls. Plato's criticism of art rests on his metaphysics. Physical objects, he argues, are already imitations or copies of forms. A physical bed is an imperfect copy of the form of bed. When a painter paints a bed, he creates an imitation of an imitation, something twice removed from reality. The painter does not even need to know how to make a bed. He only needs to know how a bed appears. His art is concerned with appearance rather than reality, with how things look rather than how they are, than what they truly are. This makes art, in Plato's view, fundamentally deceptive. It can make things appear beautiful or good when they are not, can represent vicious actions in attractive ways, can move emotions without engaging reason. Poetry is even more dangerous because it deals with the most important subjects: virtue, justice, the gods, the meaning of life. Homer and the tragic poets were regarded as educators in Greek culture, their works memorized and cited as authorities on how to live. But Plato argues that poets do not have knowledge. They write from inspiration or divine madness, not from understanding. They can make things sound profound without actually being wise. Worse, poetry appeals to the appetitive and spirited parts of the soul rather than reason. Tragic drama evokes pity and fear. Comedy encourages us to laugh at what should be deplored. Epic poetry glorifies warriors whose values are often questionable. By stirring these emotions, poetry strengthens the irrational parts of the soul and weakens reason's control. It feeds the beast within us rather than cultivating the divine. Plato is particularly concerned about the psychological effects of dramatic poetry. When we watch a play or hear a rhapsode perform Homer, we identify with characters, we feel their emotions, sympathize with their actions. If the characters are noble and virtuous, this might be beneficial. But Greek drama and epic are full of characters behaving badly, of heroes driven by anger or lust, of gods acting immorally. By repeatedly exposing ourselves to these representations, Plato fears, we cultivate these same dispositions in our souls. We practice feeling emotions we should suppress, admire actions we should condemn. This is why he insists that poetry must be censored in the ideal city, limited to hymns to gods and praises of good men. No tragic drama showing human suffering, no comedy mocking virtue, no epic glorifying the passions. Only art that strengthens reason and cultivates virtue should be permitted. This position has struck many readers as puritanical and Philistine. How could the author of such beautiful dialogues condemn Homer and the tragedians? How could someone so clearly an artist himself distrust art so deeply? Part of the answer is that Plato is not condemning all art, but only art that is not subordinated to philosophy and truth. Art that serves the good, that leads souls upward toward the forms, that teaches virtue while delighting the senses. This art is valuable. The problem is that most actual art does not do this. Most poetry and drama is created for pleasure and acclaim, not from knowledge or in service of the good. It is art unmoored from truth that Plato critiques, art that makes no claim to wisdom, yet exercises enormous influence over how people think and feel. Moreover, Plato's critique reflects his larger concern about the power of imitation, or mimesis. Human beings are naturally imitative. We copy what we see, model ourselves on examples, absorb the values of the stories we hear. This is why education must be carefully controlled, especially for the young. If we imitate bad examples, we become bad. If we imitate good examples, we become good. The philosopher imitates the forms themselves, the eternal patterns of beauty, justice, and goodness, striving to make the soul an image of divine order. The artist, by contrast, often imitates the changing, imperfect, visible world, or even just appearances of that world, perpetuating illusion rather than leading toward truth. Yet, Plato's own practice complicates his theory. His dialogues are works of art, carefully crafted imitations of philosophical conversations. They use dramatic techniques, vivid characters, irony, humor, and myth to convey philosophical ideas. Plato clearly believed that the right kind of literary art could serve philosophy, could be a vehicle for truth rather than illusion. Perhaps the key is that Platonic dialogues never let us forget they are imitations, are questions rather than answers, provocations to thought rather than authorities to accept uncritically. They use art to lead beyond art, use beautiful words to point toward beauty itself, use imitations to awaken the desire for what is genuinely real. In this way, they are philosophical art, art that serves truth rather than merely pleasing or deceiving. Chapter 13. The Later Years and Final Reflections. As Plato entered his final decades, he continued to write, teach, and refine his philosophical vision. The academy flourished under his leadership, attracting brilliant students and producing influential thinkers. Yet Plato's later works show a philosopher willing to question and revise even his most cherished doctrines, never content to rest in certainty, always pushing toward deeper understanding. The Theaetetus, written when Plato was probably in his 70s, revisits the fundamental question: what is knowledge? The dialogue examines and rejects several definitions, including the influential proposal that knowledge is true, belief with an account, or logos. The dialogue ends in aporia, perplexity without a satisfying answer. This return to the Socratic mode, philosophy as questioning rather than doctrine, suggests that even late in life, Plato recognized the limits of what could be definitively known. The Parmenides is even more radical. In this dialogue, the young Socrates presents the theory of forms to the elderly philosopher Parmenides and his student Zeno. Parmenides subjects the theory to a series of devastating objections. If forms are separate from physical objects, how can objects participate in them? If a form is present in many objects, is it divided into parts? If not, how can it be entirely in each object? The dialogue raises problems that Plato may never have fully resolved, suggesting a philosopher willing to scrutinize even his most fundamental commitments. The sophist and politicus, statesman, show Plato developing new methods of dialectic, particularly the method of division, systematically dividing genera into species to arrive at precise definitions. These dialogues also show a more charitable engagement with earlier philosophers, attempting to mediate between Heraclitean flux and Parmenidean being, finding a middle ground that acknowledges both change and stability, both becoming and being. In the Sophist, Plato even commits what earlier dialogues would have considered philosophical parricide, criticizing his teacher's teacher Parmenides by arguing that non-being in some sense is, that we can think and speak meaningfully about what is not. The Timaeus, one of Plato's most influential works, presents a cosmological myth describing the creation of the universe. A divine craftsman or demiurge shapes chaotic matter according to the eternal forms, creating the physical cosmos as a kind of living, rational organism. The dialogue combines mathematics, astronomy, physics, and metaphysics in an ambitious attempt to explain the structure of reality. Though presented as a likely story rather than certain truth, the Timaeus offered a vision of an ordered, purposeful cosmos that would dominate Western thought for centuries, influencing both Christian theology and early modern science. Plato's final work, The Laws, is his longest dialogue and in some ways his most surprising. It abandons many of the radical proposals of the Republic, the communism of the guardian class, the equality of women, the rule of philosopher kings. Instead, it describes a more practical political system for a colony to be established in Crete, with detailed laws governing everything from property ownership to marriage to religious festivals. The emphasis is not on creating perfect philosopher rulers, but on using well-crafted laws to constrain human imperfection and cultivate virtue as much as possible in ordinary citizens. The dialogue is long, detailed, sometimes tedious. The work of an old man trying to think through practical problems of governance rather than construct an ideal in speech. Yet even here, Plato's fundamental commitments remain: that the goal of politics is virtue, that education is central to the good city, that reason should guide human life. The Laws shows a philosopher who has learned from experience, who recognizes that pure theory cannot simply be imposed on political reality, but who still believes that philosophy has something essential to offer to the organization of human communities. Throughout these later works, we see a mind still vigorously engaged, still questioning, still willing to revise and complicate earlier positions. Plato, in his 70s and 80s, was not rigidly defending an established system, but continuing the philosophical inquiry that had defined his life since he first encountered Socrates. He had built the academy, trained generations of students, written dialogues that would shape Western thought, yet he remained fundamentally a seeker rather than a sage, a lover of wisdom rather than one who claimed to possess it fully. As Plato aged, his physical strength declined, but his mental acuity apparently remained sharp. He continued to preside over the academy, though doubtless with increasing assistance from senior students like Speusippus and Xenocrates. He revised earlier dialogues and worked on the Laws, which he left unfinished at his death. According to later accounts, he was revising it even in his final days, still refining arguments, still searching for the right words to express philosophical truths. The academy had become his life's greatest achievement, not just a school, but a community dedicated to philosophy, a place where the love of wisdom was cultivated and transmitted from one generation to the next. Through the academy, Plato ensured that philosophy would survive as an institution, would continue beyond the life of any individual philosopher. Socrates had left no institution, only the inspiration of his example and the writings of his students. Plato created something more lasting, a structure that would endure for centuries, that would preserve and develop his ideas while also allowing them to evolve and be challenged. Chapter 14: The Death of Plato and His Immediate Legacy. In 348 or 347 BC, at the age of 80 or 81, Plato died in Athens. The ancient sources offer different accounts of his final days. Some say he died peacefully in his sleep, others that he died at a wedding feast, still engaged with the social world despite his age. One romantic account claims that he died with a Pythagorean woman playing music at his bedside, perhaps suggesting a peaceful end accompanied by the mathematical harmonies he had so valued. The details may be embellished or invented, but what matters is that Plato died in the city where he had lived most of his life, surrounded by the academy he had created, having completed a body of work that would define Western philosophy. His death marked the end of an era. The great trio of Greek philosophers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, had been connected in an unbroken chain of teaching and learning. Socrates had taught Plato. Plato had taught Aristotle. With Plato's death, this direct line ended. The academy continued under new leadership, but it would gradually evolve, eventually diverging significantly from Plato's original vision. Plato's nephew, Speusippus, became the second head of the academy, leading it from 347 to 339 BC. He developed Plato's ideas in new directions, placing even greater emphasis on mathematics and numbers as the fundamental principles of reality. Xenocrates succeeded Speusippus and led the academy from 339 to 314 BC, further systematizing Platonic doctrines and defending them against critics. Under these early successors, the academy remained influential, attracting students from across the Greek world. Aristotle did not stay at the academy after Plato's death. He left Athens, traveled, served as tutor to the young Alexander of Macedon, and eventually returned to Athens to found his own school, the Lyceum. The philosophical rivalry between the academy and the Lyceum, between Platonic and Aristotelian approaches to philosophy, would shape intellectual debate for centuries. The Lyceum emphasized empirical observation and systematic classification of natural phenomena. The academy focused on dialectic and mathematics, on ascending from the physical world to eternal forms. Both schools claimed to be following in Socrates' footsteps. Both believed they were pursuing truth through philosophical inquiry, but their methods and emphases differed significantly. In the generations after Plato, the academy went through several phases, traditionally divided into the Old Academy under Plato and his immediate successors, the Middle Academy under Arcesilaus in the 3rd century BC, which adopted a skeptical stance and focused on refuting dogmatic claims rather than establishing positive doctrines, and the New Academy under Carneades in the 2nd century BC, which continued the skeptical tradition while developing sophisticated arguments against Stoic epistemology. By this time, the academy had moved far from Plato's original vision, yet it still claimed his authority and worked within the tradition he established. The academy finally ended in 86 BC, when the Roman general Sulla destroyed it during his sack of Athens. For 900 years, from its founding in 387 BC to its destruction, the academy had been a center of philosophical learning, the oldest continuous institution of higher education in the Western world. When Renaissance humanists later founded universities and academies, they consciously modeled them on Plato's institution, borrowing even the name. To this day, academic and academy testify to Plato's enduring influence. But Plato's legacy extended far beyond the institutional academy. His dialogues survived, copied and recopied by scribes, studied and commented upon by philosophers in every subsequent age. Unlike many ancient texts that were lost, all of Plato's dialogues that circulated in antiquity have come down to us, preserved through the tumultuous centuries of the late Roman Empire, the Middle Ages, and into the modern era. This extraordinary preservation testifies to how highly Plato was valued, how essential his works seemed to those who studied them. In the centuries immediately following his death, Plato's influence permeated Greek and Roman intellectual life. The Stoics, though they disagreed with many of his doctrines, were deeply influenced by his ethics and his vision of a rational cosmos. The Epicureans positioned themselves as anti-Platonists, rejecting forms and immortal souls in favor of atomism and materialism. Yet even their opposition shows Plato's centrality to philosophical debate. Middle Platonists in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD developed Plato's ideas in new directions, increasingly reading them through a religious lens, seeing Plato as almost a prophet of philosophical theology. Chapter 15: The Eternal Dialogue. As we reach the end of this journey through Plato's life, we might pause and consider what makes this ancient philosopher, dead for nearly 24 centuries, still relevant and compelling. Part of the answer lies in the questions he asked. Plato was concerned with perennial human questions, questions that arise in every age and culture because they are rooted in the human condition itself. What is the good life? What is justice? How should we organize our communities? What can we know and how can we know it? What happens when we die? These questions do not admit of final, settled answers. Each generation must grapple with them anew in light of its own circumstances and challenges. Plato's genius was not in providing definitive answers, but in showing how to think about these questions philosophically, rigorously, openly. But even more important than the questions is the method Plato exemplified and taught. The dialogues are not treatises, proclaiming truth, but conversations exploring possibilities. They are invitations to think, provocations to question what we thought we knew, stimuli to examine our lives and beliefs. This dialogical approach, this commitment to following arguments wherever they lead, to questioning authority and conventional wisdom, to seeking clarity and consistency in our thinking, this is Plato's deepest legacy. It is the foundation of Western philosophy and arguably of critical thinking itself. Plato taught that philosophy is not a body of doctrines to memorize, but a practice to engage in, not a destination, but a journey. The philosopher is a lover of wisdom, not someone who possesses it fully. This humility, learned from Socrates, combined with the ambition to understand ultimate reality, creates a tension that drives philosophical inquiry forward. We know we do not know, yet we cannot stop seeking to know. We recognize the limits of human reason, yet we cannot help but use reason to push against those limits. We understand that absolute certainty may be impossible, yet we continue to seek truth. Plato's own life embodied this tension. He experienced the trauma of Socrates' execution, the failure of his political interventions in Syracuse, the recognition that his ideal city might exist only in speech. Yet he never abandoned philosophy, never ceased writing, teaching, and seeking wisdom. The academy flourished for centuries because Plato had created not just a school, but a tradition, a way of approaching fundamental questions that could survive the deaths of individual philosophers. In this sense, Plato remains alive in every genuine philosophical conversation, in every classroom where teacher and students together examine ideas critically, in every person who pauses to question assumptions and seek deeper understanding. The dialogues, written 2 millennia and more ago, still speak to readers today with undiminished power. We encounter Socrates questioning Euthyphro about piety, arguing with Thrasymachus about justice, consoling his friends in prison, and we recognize these conversations as our own. The particular historical context may be ancient Athens, but the philosophical problems are timeless. When Socrates asks, "What is courage?" or "What is beauty?" or "How should we live?" he is asking us. The dialogues do not give us easy answers, but they show us how to think, how to question, how to examine our lives. Plato understood something fundamental about human existence, that we are creatures capable of transcendence, able to think beyond our immediate circumstances, to grasp eternal truths, to aspire to goodness beyond what the world presents. Whether or not one accepts the theory of forms, the vision behind it remains powerful, that there is more to reality than meets the eye, that truth and goodness are real and worth seeking, that the examined life is indeed the only life worth living, his faith in reason, his conviction that careful thought can illuminate the deepest questions, his belief that education can transform souls. These commitments define philosophy itself. In an age of relativism, cynicism, and distrust of grand narratives, Plato's unwavering commitment to truth and goodness can seem naive. In an age of specialization and technical expertise, his vision of philosophy as comprehensive wisdom about how to live can seem impossibly ambitious. In an age valuing practical results, his emphasis on contemplation and theoretical knowledge can seem irrelevant. Yet perhaps these very tensions make Plato essential now. We need to be reminded that some questions matter more than efficiency or utility, that the search for truth and goodness is not reducible to opinion or preference, that education should aim at wisdom and virtue, not just marketable skills. We need philosophers who dare to think about ultimate questions, even when those questions have no easy answers. As the shadows lengthen and our journey through, Plato's life comes to an end. We might imagine the academy in its final evening. Plato walking among the olive trees, conversing with students about the forms, about justice, about the immortality of the soul. The scene would have been peaceful, beautiful, touched with the golden light of the Mediterranean sunset. Plato would have known, perhaps, that his time was ending, that soon he would experience what he had argued for all his life, the separation of soul from body, the journey to whatever lies beyond. Did he believe his own arguments for immortality? Did he face death with the calm certainty of Socrates, confident that the philosopher has nothing to fear? We cannot know. What we know is that he devoted his life to seeking truth, to educating souls, to creating something that would outlast him. The academy is long destroyed. The ancient world that produced it vanished. But the dialogues remain, and with them, the invitation to philosophy. Every reader who picks up the Republic, or the Symposium, or the Phaedo, enters into conversation with Plato, becomes part of the academy. The dialogue continues across centuries and cultures, as living and vital now as when Plato first wrote. In this eternal dialogue, in this endless seeking after wisdom, in this examination of life and its meaning, Plato achieves the immortality he wrote about. Not because his soul departed to the realm of forms, though he certainly believed it did, but because his ideas, his questions, his method live on in everyone who thinks philosophically. The unexamined life is not worth living, Socrates said, and Plato spent 80 years examining life with unmatched depth and brilliance. His journey from young aristocrat to devoted student, to grieving witness to philosopher and teacher, to founder of the academy, to political advisor, to aged writer, still refining his final dialogue, this journey is the story of what it means to dedicate a life to wisdom. And so we leave Plato, not in death, but in the eternal conversation he began, the dialogue about truth, beauty, justice, and the good that continues wherever humans think deeply about what matters most. Thank you for joining me on this fascinating journey through the life of Plato. May his example inspire us to live examined lives, to seek wisdom, and to never stop questioning.